Buried beneath GM's legacy of legendary muscle and innovation are a handful of cars so risky, so poorly engineered, or so recklessly overpowered, it's hard to believe they ever reached the public. These weren't just flawed, they were dangerous by design or neglect. From unstable handling to fire-prone engines, from deadly weight balance to sheer uncontrollable speed, these cars pushed past the limits of what was safe, and sometimes what was legal. The 1960 Chevrolet Corvair is perhaps one of the most storied cautionary tales in American automotive history. A compact car born of bold engineering, corporate ambition, and tragically flawed execution. In theory, the Corvair was revolutionary. Chevrolet sought to create a domestic answer to the rising popularity of small European imports like the Volkswagen Beetle, and they went all in on radical ideas. Air-cooled flat six engine? Yes. Rear-mounted power plant? Absolutely. Unibody construction with clean lines and no grille? Groundbreaking. It was General Motors' attempt to prove it could innovate just as boldly as the Europeans. And for a brief moment, it seemed they had done exactly that. But beneath the clean styling and forward-thinking concept lay a host of deadly compromises. The Corvair's biggest flaw came from its suspension design, specifically the infamous swing-axle rear suspension used in the early models, 1960-1963. The swing-axle setup was borrowed from designs like the Beetle's, but without fully understanding or addressing its dangerous side effects. Unlike modern independent rear suspensions, the swing axles had a nasty habit under hard cornering or sudden maneuvers. The wheels could tuck under, changing their camber dramatically, and lifting one rear wheel off the ground while the other folded sharply under the car. This led to unpredictable and violent oversteer, a phenomenon known today as jacking. The Corvair could behave safely in mild driving, but when pushed, transitioned abruptly from stable understeer to sudden and uncontrollable snap oversteer with almost no warning. Worse still, Chevrolet didn't initially equip the Corvair with a front anti-roll bar, a feature that could have mitigated some of these handling flaws. Instead, they recommended tire pressure differences, 15 psi front, 26 psi rear, assuming the average driver would religiously check their tire pressures weekly to prevent imbalance. They wouldn't. Few people ever did. And without those pressures carefully maintained, the Corvair became extremely tail-happy and unstable, particularly in emergency situations or high-speed maneuvers. Power from the air-cooled flat-six engine was modest, around 80 horsepower in base form, but the engine's placement over the rear axle amplified the swing axle effect, giving the rear even more tendency to break loose. The Corvair wasn't a performance car, but in its attempt to be sporty and efficient, it became treacherous. There were no stability aids, no traction control, and no second chances once the rear end began to swing. Enter Ralph Nader in his bombshell 1965 book, Unsafe at Any Speed, in which the Corvair played the role of villain in the opening chapter. Nader savaged GM for knowingly selling a car with what he called a one-car accident design, unsafe by its very architecture. The resulting outcry wasn't just about the Corvair, it triggered a nationwide conversation about automobile safety, corporate responsibility, and the need for regulation. Nader's campaign against the Corvair didn't just damage the car's reputation, it led to the creation of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the beginning of federal safety oversight in the automotive industry. In truth, later versions of the Corvair from 1965 onward corrected many of the early suspension issues, replacing the swing axle setup with a fully independent rear suspension similar to the Corvette Stingray. By then, however, the damage had been done. Public confidence had eroded, sales had plummeted, and GM, rather than defending the car with transparency, attempted to discredit Nader in a campaign that backfired spectacularly and made him a national figure. The Corvair became a scapegoat, a cautionary icon of what happens when innovation is driven by style and cost-cutting, rather than safety and user awareness. Today, the early Corvair is both a fascinating engineering experiment and a ghost story, sleek, ahead of its time, and tragically misunderstood. In the hands of an experienced driver who respects its quirks, it can be charming, even fun. But for the average buyer in 1960, unaware of its unpredictable handling dynamics, it was a trap lying in wait. No airbags, no crumple zones, no safety net. Just a beautiful little car with a treacherous rear end and a fatal design flaw. One that helped change the entire course of American automotive safety, but not before claiming its place in infamy. The 1965 Buick Wildcat 425 Super Wildcat was one of the great paradoxes of the American performance era, a car that promised brute strength and high-speed dominance, but delivered it inside the body of a stately gentleman's cruiser with little regard for stopping, turning, or surviving the aftermath of its own power. It wasn't a muscle car in the traditional sense. There were no racing stripes, no hood scoops, no aggressive marketing campaigns featuring drag strips or burnout clouds. No, the Wildcat wore its menace like a three-piece suit, clean, elegant, understated, and utterly unprepared for the violent fury lurking beneath the hood. At the heart of this contradiction was Buick's legendary 425 cubic inch nailhead V8. In its most potent form, the Super Wildcat, this massive power plant was outfitted with dual 4-barrel Carter carburetors, a hotter camshaft, high-compression pistons, and a larger intake manifold. The result was an advertised 360 horsepower and an earth-moving 465 lb-ft of torque, which arrived like a freight train by 2,800 RPM. The engine bay of the Wildcat was so stuffed with displacement that the V8 looked as if it were trying to break out of its metal cage. This wasn't just a big engine, it was a statement. Floor the throttle, and the Wildcat didn't so much accelerate as it lunged, hurling its massive weight forward with a deep guttural roar that could send coffee flying from dashboard trays and push unwary passengers deep into their button-tufted bench seats. It could run a sub-16-second quarter mile in the right hands, an astonishing feat for a car that weighed around 4,300 pounds without passengers. The torque hit like a hammer, and unlike many muscle cars of the time, it didn't need to rev high, it just pulled, relentlessly, effortlessly, as if daring you to ask for more. But as soon as the road stopped being straight, the fantasy unraveled. The Wildcat's suspension was tuned for boulevard ride, or not cornering prowess. Buick customers expected silence, smoothness, and luxury, and that's what they got. Coil springs on all four corners soaked up imperfections with grace, but that same softness made cornering at speed feel like balancing a bathtub full of water on 4 bowling balls. Body roll was dramatic, even frightening. In sweeping bends, the car leaned so hard you could feel your whole body shift in protest. And if you hit a bump mid-turn, you were no longer driving, you were negotiating with physics. Then came the brakes, or lack thereof. 4-wheel drums were still the norm in 1965, but the Wildcats were particularly inadequate given its size and speed. Brake fade set in fast under heavy use, especially on long descents or repeated stops. The big Buick didn't stop, so much as it considered stopping. Eventually, panic stops required both feet and a prayer. Owners in hilly areas learned quickly to downshift just to save their brake shoes from catching fire. And the steering, over-assisted, vague, and eerily disconnected from the road, felt less like a control mechanism and more like a polite suggestion box. The steering wheel itself was thin-rimmed and enormous, reminiscent of a school bus, and required constant correction. Turn the wheel and the front end followed. Eventually. Maybe. If the road wasn't wet and the tires weren't cold and the suspension wasn't already leaning to one side. Inside, the Wildcat was pure American opulence. Bucket seats were optional, but most came with full-width benches wrapped in plush vinyl or brocade. Faux wood trim, chrome highlights, and wide padded dashboards gave it a sense of occasion. But safety was an afterthought. No headrests, no seatbelts unless you specifically asked. The dashboard was hard metal. The steering column was non-collapsible. In a crash, it became a spear. Buick advertised rocket action and turbine drive, but never mentioned survivability. Style ruled the day. Safety be damned. Perhaps what's most fascinating is how quickly the Super Wildcat disappeared. The option itself was quietly dropped by 1966, buried beneath the rising popularity of GM's other muscle offerings. The GTO, the Chevelle SS396, the 442. Buick returned to its roots of soft, refined power and let the Wildcat fade into quiet obscurity. Few buyers sought out the Super Wildcat package in the first place. It was expensive, rare, and misunderstood. Today, verified examples are unicorns, often misidentified or mistaken for base 425 cars. The ones that do survive are usually restored by passionate collectors who understand just how special and how dangerous this car really was. The 1965 Buick Wildcat 425 Super Wildcat wasn't a car for the average driver. It was a high-velocity contradiction, a land yacht with the heart of a drag racer, a luxury cruiser armed with muscle car firepower, but none of the reflexes to control it. It was elegant, imposing, and absurdly fast. But to truly drive one, to really push it, was to flirt with disaster. The 1966 Oldsmobile Toronado was a landmark car for General Motors, a technological moonshot dressed in a sleek fastback body. It was the first mass-produced American front-wheel drive car since the Cord 810 of the 1930s, and unlike anything else on the road when it debuted. Beneath the dramatic clamshell wheel, arches, and long, low hood lurked an experimental powertrain arrangement that promised revolutionary traction and packaging, and delivered, at least in part. But while the Toronado was a triumph of engineering audacity, it was also a handful, brilliant on paper, but often terrifying in the real world, especially when you pushed it beyond the limits of 1960s tire and suspension technology. Oldsmobile engineers were trying to solve a problem that barely existed yet: how to channel massive V8 power to the pavement in a big, luxurious American coupe without losing control or wasting interior space. Their answer was the Unitized Power Package, UPP, a compact assembly that paired GM's massive 425 cubic inch Super Rocket V8 with a modified turbo-hydromatic 425 transmission, all mounted transversely over the front wheels. A Morse high-value chain, over an inch wide, transferred torque from the engine to the gearbox. It was a complex, heavy, and unprecedented system that managed to send a jaw-dropping 385 horsepower and 475 volume of torque directly to the front tires. And those tires did not want it. Stomp on the gas in a 66 Toronado and the car would lurch sideways, the front wheels clawing for traction while the steering wheel tried to rip itself out of your hands. This was torque steer in its rawest, most unfiltered form. There was no electronic traction control, no modern equal-length half-shafts, no fancy torque vectoring, just brute mechanical force delivered straight to a pair of 8.55-inch wide bias-ply tires. The result was a car that required strength, skill, and sometimes a leap of faith to drive aggressively. The sheer mass of the car didn't help matters. The Toronado tipped the scales at over 4,300 pounds, with nearly 60% of that weight over the front axle. While the FWD layout provided excellent traction off the line in dry conditions, something muscle cars often struggled with, it created a nightmare scenario on slick or uneven pavement. Understeer wasn't just a tendency, it was the car's default reaction to every corner. Try to turn hard at speed, and the nose would plow forward like a runaway toboggan. Hit the throttle mid-corner, and the car could suddenly shift its trajectory as the tires regained or lost grip in unpredictable ways. And God help you if you hit standing water. Hydroplaning in a Toronado felt like trying to steer a refrigerator on roller skates. Braking was another matter entirely. The Toronado came with finned drum brakes all around in 1906. Disc brakes wouldn't arrive until 1967. And those drums had to bring down a massive, fast-moving cruiser with far more horsepower than grip. Repeated stops caused fade. Emergency braking produced nosedive and long, jittery slides. And unlike rear-wheel drive cars, the nose-heavy Toronado didn't have the same natural weight transfer to the rear under acceleration, meaning braking balance was never ideal. Inside, the car was pure Oldsmobile luxury, wide seats, sculpted dashboard, and a speedometer that looked like a rolling film reel. It was futuristic and elegant, and there was no denying that the Toronado made an impression wherever it went. It felt special, and it looked unlike anything else on the road. In fact, from a distance, It still looks like something that escaped from a GM concept garage. Long hood, short deck, fastback, roofline, hidden headlights, and an aggressive stance. It was clearly designed to be more than just a car. It was a statement, and in that sense it succeeded. But for all its design brilliance and mechanical innovation, the Toronado was a deeply flawed machine when judged by its road behavior. The handling was unpredictable, especially in bad weather. The steering, while responsive at low speeds, became vague and nervous under hard acceleration. The power delivery was aggressive and sudden, and the front tires simply couldn't cope with the monumental torque being thrown at them. It was fast, yes, but with speed came a kind of nervous energy that few drivers of the time were prepared for. One misjudged turn, one wet corner, one panic stop, and the Toronado revealed its Jekyll and Hyde nature. Perhaps that's why, despite glowing initial reviews and Motor Trend's Car of the Year award, the Toronado never became the revolution Oldsmobile hoped it would. Sales were respectable, but not extraordinary. The model remained in production for decades, eventually evolving into a softer, more conservative personal luxury coupe. But that first-year 1966 model remains the wild one, the dreamer, the pioneer, the beast. Today, the original Toronado is appreciated by collectors and engineers alike for its boldness. The 1969 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1 is one of the most mythical muscle cars ever built, an exotic, street-legal race car disguised as a pony car. It exists today more as a symbol of excess and engineering audacity than as a practical performance machine. Only 69 were ever made, and for good reason. The car was outrageously expensive, brutally uncompromising, and nearly undrivable on real roads. But that's precisely what makes it such an icon. The ZL1 wasn't just fast, it was borderline insane, built not for public consumption, but to exploit a loophole in racing rules and shove 500-plus horsepower into the hands of a select few who dared. At the heart of the ZL1 was the all-aluminum 427 cubic inch big block V8, coded ZL1 and born in Chevrolet Skunk Works for Can-Am racing. It was not just a high-performance engine. It was an overbuilt, dry-sleeved, purpose-built racing motor designed to run wide-open throttle all day long. Its crankshaft was forged steel. Its pistons were high compression. Its internals were designed to withstand punishing abuse. Officially rated at 430 horsepower, pure fiction. Most dynoed well north of 500, even in street tune, with some reports suggesting numbers as high as 550 HP right out of the crate. Tuned properly, it was a quarter-mile monster, capable of 11-second times at a time when most muscle cars were struggling to break 13. But Chevrolet never really intended for the public to buy the ZL1. It existed because of the COPO, Central Office Production Order, system, a backdoor way for dealers and racers to order cars with off-menu options, like the ZL1 engine. Dealer Fred Gibb in La Harpe, Illinois, was the one who made it happen. He needed 50 cars to qualify the ZL1 engine for NHRA Superstock drag racing, and Chevrolet reluctantly agreed, but they hadn't prepared for what the car would actually cost. Nearly $7,200 when unoptioned, about double the price of a base Camaro, and more than a Corvette. Most buyers ran for the hills. Gibb couldn't sell his batch, and Chevrolet quietly redistributed the remaining cars to performance dealers who could. Driving a ZL1 was a workout in every sense. There was no power steering, because racers didn't need it. No power brakes, because the vacuum draw from the cam was so low that the boosters didn't work well anyway. The car idled like a cement mixer, shook like a jackhammer, and roared like a top-fuel dragster. At low speeds, it was miserable. The massive Holley 4-barrel carb sat atop an open plenum intake with porting designed for high RPM. It bogged below 3,000 RPM, snarled above 5,000, and by the time you hit 7,000, you felt like you'd angered the gods. Handling? In theory, yes. The F41 suspension was stiffened and larger brakes were added. But this was still a 1969 Camaro with leaf springs, a solid rear axle, and bias-ply tires that were instantly outmatched by the sheer torque the ZL1 delivered. It could accelerate like a missile in a straight line, but throw it into a turn and the car's composure evaporated. It didn't just understeer, It lunged like a lion, throwing its nose around with every twitch of throttle. Traction was a fantasy. With no electronics and minimal mechanical grip, drivers had to balance the line between power and disaster, with nothing but muscle memory and fear. And then there was the heat. The all-aluminum block was lightweight, around 100 kilograms lighter than the iron 427, but it ran hot, especially in traffic. The cooling system worked overtime. Long drives, not recommended. And then there was maintenance. Valve lash had to be set regularly, race fuel was almost required, and rebuilds weren't cheap. It was a race engine with license plates. You could drive it on the street, but only if you were brave, skilled, or slightly unhinged. Most owners weren't. Many of these cars were bought by drag racers, strip-ons for competition, and never saw public roads again. A few were returned to the factory because dealers simply couldn't move them. Those that did sell went into the hands of enthusiasts who understood what they were buying. Not a pony car, but a factory hot rod masquerading as one. Today, the ZL1 is a seven-figure collector car, but its legend is built not on how many people drove it, but how many couldn't. It wasn't practical, it wasn't refined, and it wasn't forgiving. It was the peak of factory-delivered muscle madness, a raw, barely tamed monster that broke the rules, terrified its drivers, and earned its place in history by being too wild for the street and too rare to ignore. To quote one former owner, "You didn't learn to drive a ZL1, you learned how not to crash it." The 1967 Pontiac GTO Ram Air 400 wasn't just a muscle car, it was a cultural earthquake. It represented everything the American car industry glorified in the 1960s: raw, unfiltered horsepower, bold styling, and a total disregard for subtlety or restraint. But behind the rumble of its high-performance V8 and the swagger of its Coke bottle curves, the GTO Ram Air 400 was also a deeply flawed machine, one that dazzled in a straight line but fell apart, sometimes literally, when asked to do anything more complex than accelerate. At the heart of the beast was the Ram Air 400 cubic-inch V8, a fire-breathing power plant that took Pontiac's already formidable engine and cranked it to 11. With special high-flow heads, a radical cam profile, free-flowing exhaust manifolds, and a cold air induction system that funneled dense air from the scooped hood directly into the carburetor, this wasn't a casual street engine, it was a barely tamed race motor. Officially rated at 360 horsepower, most insiders, and just about every owner, knew the number was sandbagged for insurance purposes. Real output hovered well above 390 HP, with neck-snapping torque delivered across the rev range. Driving one felt like trying to hold onto a live wire. The moment you touched the gas, the car surged forward with a roar that seemed to shake the pavement itself. The functional hood scoop would flap open like some predatory bird inhaling speed, and the car would launch ahead with wheel spin and righteous fury. On a deserted highway or a drag strip, it felt unstoppable. But in the real world, on winding back roads, in the rain, or through traffic, it was a completely different story. The GTO's front-heavy layout was its Achilles heel. That giant cast-iron 400 V8 hung over the nose like an anchor, and despite Pontiac's efforts with stiffer springs and a beefed-up suspension, the car handled like a runaway sofa. Turn the wheel hard at speed, and it plowed forward with relentless understeer. The rear suspension, a simple coil spring setup without any real engineering finesse, did little to inspire confidence. With little weight over the back wheels, traction was tenuous even in the dry. In the wet, it became a white-knuckle exercise in restraint and luck. And the brakes. Oh, the brakes. While front discs were technically optional, the vast majority of 1967 GTOs left the factory with four-wheel drums. And not just any drums, small, fade-prone units that quickly turned into soup under spirited driving. One owner, writing in a period review, described it like this: "You had to plan your braking in advance, hit them once hard, and you had nothing left for the next stop." At highway speeds, stopping distances were alarming. At racing speeds, they were suicidal. Inside the GTO's cabin was pure 60s Americana. vinyl, chrome, and a wide dashboard that stretched across the windshield like a landing pad. It looked great, but it was a death trap in disguise. Seat belts were lap only, shoulder belts were rare, and headrests didn't arrive until later in the model year. The steering column was a solid metal shaft, non-collapsible, pointing directly at the driver's chest. In a crash, it could become a lethal spear, and the dashboard, decked out in hard metal and brittle plastics, offered no cushioning whatsoever. If you went into it headfirst, chances were you'd come out worse than the car. The Ram Air system, for all its drama and clever engineering, was finicky and unrefined. Early versions were dealer-installed kits with a manually controlled flap under the hood scoop. If the weather turned cold or the cable froze, your power gains vanished. The aggressive camshaft created rough idling and poor vacuum at low RPMs, meaning your power brakes, if you had them, would suddenly go weak just when you needed them most. It was a power package built for racing in a car designed for street cruising, and the two never fully reconciled. And then there was the matter of its reputation. The GTO was king of the streets, and everyone wanted to take a swing at it. This led to some, shall we say, spirited driving among young owners, many of whom were in their teens or early 20s. Combine that with the car's lack of grip, vague steering, poor brakes, and complete absence of safety tech, and the result was a high number of wrecks. Insurance rates soared, dealers got nervous, and by 1968, the entire muscle car market began to feel the early tremors of government regulation and consumer backlash. Yet for all its sins, the 1967 GTO Ram Air 400 remains one of the most beloved American performance cars of all time. It was a contradiction, a car that was both exhilarating and dangerous, both visionary and primitive. It was a brute in a tailored suit, gorgeous, charismatic, and deeply flawed. Owners loved it not because it was perfect, but because it wasn't. It demanded attention, skill, and respect. It punished the careless and rewarded the brave. The 1961 Chevrolet Impala SS 409 was the original street brawler in a tuxedo. A car that sparked an entire era of big block performance with just 3 numbers, 409. It looked like your father's full-size cruiser, complete with chrome spears, 6-passenger seating, and a spacious trunk for a week's worth of groceries. But under the hood, it was a rolling declaration of war. This was Chevrolet's moment of rebellion, the year they took a staid family car and stuffed it with a brutal 409 cubic inch V8 that turned heads, twisted frames, and terrified drivers. This wasn't just any Impala. It was the birth of the Supersport badge, SS for short, and it started modestly. For 1961, Chevrolet quietly offered the Impala SS as a limited package. 5380 pounds bought you some subtle trim, spinner hubcaps, and a tachometer mounted on the steering column. But if you ticked the right boxes, you could get something much more serious. The W Series 409 V8, breathing through a single 4-barrel carb and belting out 360 horsepower and 409 lb of torque. It was Chevrolet's first real foray into big displacement muscle, and it quickly gained legendary status, immortalized in song and feared at stoplights. The engine itself was a marvel of torque-first design, a high-lift solid lifter cam, forged internals, and large port heads made the 409 a torque monster right off idle. It was based on the 348 but significantly overbuilt, with a longer stroke and a thirst for high-octane fuel. Mated to a BorgWarner T10 4-speed manual transmission, it could launch the 2-ton Impala like a cannonball. Chevrolet never officially advertised Euro 60 times, but contemporary road tests hinted at low 6-second sprints, unheard of for a full-size car in 1961. If you were drag racing on a straight level highway, the Impala 409 was a kingmaker. But while the engine earned a place in the Performance Hall of Fame, the rest of the car didn't exactly keep up. The 1961 Impala still rode on GM's infamous X-frame chassis, a design that had debuted in 1958 and looking good on paper, but failed spectacularly in real-world safety and performance. With no perimeter rails and limited lateral support, the X-frame offered almost zero protection in a side impact. More importantly, it flexed under torque. Hammer the throttle in a hard corner, and you could feel the whole structure twist. Body panels shifted, the steering wandered, and the rear end squirmed like a wet dog on linoleum. It was built for comfort and style, not lateral grip or high-speed cornering. The suspension, while technically heavy-duty in SS trim, consisted of soft coil springs and basic dampers. It was tuned for the boulevard, not the back roads. Hit an uneven patch of road at speed, and the Impala bounced, dipped, and leaned like a ferry in a storm. Combine that with bias-ply tires the width of garden hoses, and cornering became more of a negotiation than a maneuver. Brakes were manual four-wheel drums, adequate for a six-cylinder cruiser, but laughably insufficient for a car capable of laying down 100 miles before the quarter-mile mark. One owner from the era summed it up in a 1962 letter to Hot Rod magazine. "It goes like a jet, but you'd better pray it stops. At high speed, it feels like the doors want to leave the car." Inside, it was all flash and chrome. Beautiful, yes, but ergonomically primitive. No seatbelts, no headrests, a rigid steel dashboard, and a steering column pointed squarely at your chest. If you lost control, and many did, you were at the mercy of fate in poor crash engineering. It was a time when style outweighed safety, and the Impala 409 embodied that philosophy to an extreme. Chevy never expected the 409 to change the world, but it did. It laid the groundwork for the muscle car movement that would explode just a few years later. And even though the early 61s were low in number, fewer than 500 were made with the 409 that first year, their impact was seismic. By 1962, the 409 had gained dual quad carbs and even more power, and every teenager in America knew the chorus, "She's real fine, my 409." But the 1961 version, raw, underdeveloped, and wild, was a different beast. It was the prototype muscle car in a full-size disguise. It roared, it rattled, and it demanded every ounce of your attention. One pothole at speed could send it sideways, and one mistimed downshift could fry the clutch or lock the rear wheels. You didn't drive a 1961 Impala SS 409. You tamed it, if you were lucky. Today they're rare, coveted, and jaw-droppingly valuable. But they're also a cautionary tale of early muscle. When Detroit first asked the question, "What happens if we put race car power in a street car?" without yet understanding the consequences. The answer, in the case of the 61 Impala 409, was a four-wheeled thrill ride that was as dangerous as it was fast. It wasn't safe, it wasn't balanced, but it was unforgettable. The 1969 Chevrolet Corvair Monza Spider was the final, most potent chapter in the life of a car that had become one of the most controversial and misunderstood vehicles in American automotive history. To understand the Monza Spider's significance, you have to look back at the full arc of the Corvair's story, a tale of innovation, ambition, scandal, and finally, cautious refinement. When the Corvair was first introduced in 1960, Chevrolet threw the rule book out the window. It was a compact car with a rear-mounted, air-cooled flat-six engine, a design more commonly seen in European sports cars like the Porsche 356 than in Detroit sedans. This configuration gave the Corvair a low hood line and compact footprint, but it came with handling challenges that few American drivers or engineers fully grasped at the time. The early Corvairs featured a swing-axle rear suspension, a design that, while economical and lightweight, was notorious for its sudden snap-oversteer characteristics under hard cornering or emergency maneuvers. Combined with the rear engine weight bias, this setup made the car prone to spinning out if mishandled. Ralph Nader's landmark 1965 book, Unsafe at Any Speed, famously singled out the Corvair's handling as dangerously flawed, sparking public outcry and government scrutiny. Although some of Nader's claims were exaggerated, the safety concerns were serious enough to damage the Corvair's reputation irreparably. By 1965, Chevrolet had begun addressing these problems. They replaced the swing axle design with a fully independent rear suspension featuring semi-trailing arms, which improved stability, reduced the risk of sudden oversteer, and gave the Corvair a more predictable and composed ride. The steering system was revised for better feel and response, and other chassis upgrades followed. These changes made the Corvair a much better car to drive, but by then, the damage was done. Many buyers remained wary, and sales declined as muscle cars with traditional front-engine layouts flooded the market. Fast forward to 1969, the last year of production for the Corvair. The Monza Spider was the performance pinnacle, equipped with a turbocharged 2.7-liter flat-six engine that produced a claimed 180 horsepower. Impressive for a lightweight compact car, especially one of its era. The turbocharger was a cutting-edge addition, a rare application of forced induction on an American car at the time. It promised exciting performance, with brisk acceleration and a distinctive turbo whistle that set it apart from any other domestic car on the road. However, turbocharging the Corvair's air-cooled engine introduced new complications. The turbo lag, the brief but noticeable delay between stepping on the accelerator and the turbo spooling up, could catch drivers off guard. When boost finally kicked in, power surged suddenly, which was a precarious situation for a car with the Corvair's rear engine layout and weight distribution. Drivers needed to be cautious and experienced to handle the spike in power smoothly. Moreover, the air-cooled turbo engine sometimes emitted oil smoke under heavy boost, a symptom of the cooling and lubrication challenges inherent in the design. While visually dramatic, the smoke also indicated that the engine was being pushed close to its limits. Reliability under turbocharging stress was a concern for many owners. The handling, while significantly improved over the early models, remained idiosyncratic. The fully independent rear suspension helped tame the Corvair's behavior, but the rear-heavy layout still demanded respect. The car could be agile in the hands of skilled drivers, but sudden throttle application in tight corners or wet conditions could easily provoke the tail to step out. Unlike the more forgiving front-engine muscle cars of the time, the Corvair required a delicate touch. Interior and features for the Monza. Spider reflected its sporty intentions but stayed practical. The car had bucket seats, a center console, and special badging that distinguished it from lower-trim Corvairs. It was a driver's car in many ways, but its quirks limited its appeal to enthusiasts who were willing to master its unique challenges. By 1969, the muscle car era was in full swing, dominated by bold, aggressive front-engine V8s like the Camaro Z28, Mustang Boss 302, and Dodge Charger RT. In that landscape, the Corvair looked and felt like an oddball, a compact, quirky sports car that had struggled to shake off its early negative reputation. Chevrolet discontinued the Corvair after 1969, marking the end of an experiment that was ahead of its time, but ultimately too niche and complicated for mass-market success. Today, the 1969 Corvair Monza Spider Turbo remains a fascinating relic, a car that dared to be different, pioneering turbocharging and rear-engine packaging in American production cars long before such ideas became mainstream. The 1965 Chevrolet Chevelle Malibu SS 327 occupies a fascinating and somewhat paradoxical place in the muscle car pantheon. To most casual observers, the Chevelle Malibu was just another mid-size family car, comfortable, practical, and visually restrained. Its clean lines and moderate proportions gave it the appearance of a sensible, everyday vehicle. But those who knew the options list understood that beneath that modest exterior could lurk a genuine muscle car powerhouse, especially when equipped with the L79 327 cubic inch V8 engine. This 327 small block V8 was a significant step up in performance for the Chevelle Malibu. Rated at a healthy 350 horsepower, the L79 version featured a solid lifter camshaft, high compression ratio, and a 4-barrel carburetor, all working together to make the car a lightweight missile on wheels. Weighing around 200 pounds, the Malibu SS 327 could sprint to 60 mph in the low 6-second range, a figure that even some of the era's more celebrated muscle cars struggled to match. The engine's rev-happy character and willingness to deliver power across a broad RPM range made the car exhilarating to drive and deceptively quick off the line. Yet this burst of power came with a set of compromises that made the 65 Malibu SS 327 a double-edged sword. Chevrolet's focus was still largely on comfort and mass appeal, so the Chevelle's chassis and suspension components were not fully optimized for high-performance driving. The steering was often described as vague and lacking in feedback, which meant the driver could easily lose the vital connection between what the wheels were doing and what the hands felt through the steering wheel. This vague steering made precise cornering a challenge, especially at speed or on winding roads. It was a far cry from the razor-sharp steering setups that would later become hallmarks of true muscle cars and pony cars. The braking system was another weak point that compromised the car's safety and performance. Equipped mostly with drum brakes on all four corners, the 65 Chevelle's stopping power was nowhere near commensurate with the power output of the L79 engine. Drum brakes were prone to fade under repeated heavy use, such as during spirited driving or emergency stops, meaning that the car could quickly lose its ability to slow down effectively. The absence of front disc brakes, which were only just beginning to appear on some muscle cars, was a glaring safety omission by modern standards. Drivers had to exercise caution, knowing that the car's impressive acceleration was not matched by equally reliable braking performance. Perhaps even more concerning was the absence of fundamental safety features that we now take for granted. Seatbelts were optional in 1965, and many Chevelles left the factory without them, relying solely on the driver's skill and luck to avoid injury in the event of an accident. There were no airbags, no crumple zones engineered into the structure, and no reinforced safety cages. The car's unibody construction did not provide much protection in collisions, and the bias-ply tires of the era offered limited grip and stability, exacerbating the risk during sudden maneuvers or emergency braking. Another factor that influenced the car's character was the prevalence of the two-speed Power Glide automatic transmission among buyers. While convenient and smooth for everyday driving, the Power Glide was not ideal for performance applications. Its limited gear range and sluggish shifts hampered the driver's ability to keep the engine in its optimal power band, dulling throttle response and reducing engine braking capability. Enthusiasts who wanted sharper performance often opted for the manual transmission, but many Chevelle SS327s were sold with automatics, further complicating the car's already challenging handling dynamics. Taken as a whole, the 1965 Chevrolet Chevelle Malibu SS327 was a car of contrasts. On one hand, it was a sleeper muscle car, a lightweight, powerful, and fast vehicle disguised as a mild-mannered family cruiser. On the other hand, it was an example of early muscle car excess before the industry had fully come to terms with balancing power, handling, and safety. Its vague steering, weak brakes, and minimal safety equipment meant that what looked like a gentle Malibu on the surface could suddenly become a handful, an unpredictable and dangerous machine for the unprepared driver. For collectors and muscle car enthusiasts today, the 65 Malibu SS327 represents a unique chapter in Chevrolet's performance history. It's a car that rewards knowledgeable and careful drivers, offering exciting acceleration and a raw connection to the muscle car era's beginnings. But it also serves as a sobering reminder of the era's engineering limitations and the growing pains American manufacturers faced when pushing the boundaries of speed and power. The 1968 Pontiac Bonneville 428 HO stands as one of the most striking examples of the era's penchant for blending brute power with luxury, wrapped in an impossibly large and heavy package. It was a car that embodied the American automotive philosophy of the late 1960s, a time when bigger often meant better, and raw horsepower was a badge of honor, even if it came with significant compromises. At nearly 5,300 pounds and over 19 feet long, the Bonneville was not just a car, it was a rolling monument to excess, designed to ferry its occupants in cushioned comfort, but with the capability to leave smaller, lighter muscle cars in the dust. Under the hood sat the 428 high-output V8, a powerhouse displacing 7 liters of American muscle. Rated at a hefty 390 horsepower and a whopping 470 pound-feet of torque, this engine was no joke. It was essentially a detuned version of the famed 428 cubic inch W motor that had made a name for itself in racing and performance circles. This high-output HO variant offered enough grunt to accelerate the gargantuan Bonneville with surprising authority. On open stretches of highway, the Bonneville could surge forward with a majestic, thunderous growl, a reminder that despite its size, it was still a muscle car at heart. However, this was where the contradictions began. The Bonneville's chassis and suspension were engineered primarily for smooth cruising and luxury comfort, not aggressive handling or spirited driving. Its suspension featured soft springs, plentiful body roll, and a weighty, almost ponderous steering feel that sapped driver feedback. The steering system, while power-assisted, was not designed for precision, but for effortlessness, which meant the driver had to contend with a vague, disconnected sensation behind the wheel. It took large, slow inputs to change direction, and quick maneuvers were often met with resistance from the car's enormous mass. The tires further compounded these issues. The Bonneville rolled on bias-ply tires, which were standard at the time, but notoriously inferior to radials in grip, stability, and safety. Without radial tires, the enormous weight and power of the Bonneville couldn't be fully or safely harnessed during cornering or emergency maneuvers. The car's high center of gravity and soft suspension meant it leaned heavily into turns, with pronounced body roll that unsettled the chassis. In effect, driving the Bonneville on twisty roads was akin to steering a beached whale trying to escape a storm, awkward, slow to respond, and prone to unsettling shifts in balance. Braking performance was another Achilles heel. The Bonneville's massive curb weight placed enormous strain on the braking system, which consisted mostly of drum brakes that struggled to dissipate heat during repeated or prolonged stops. This led to significant brake fade, especially on downhill runs or during stop-and-go traffic, forcing drivers to anticipate stops far earlier than they might in a lighter, more modern car. The lack of front disc brakes in anti-lock braking systems, which were not yet common, meant the Bonneville was less forgiving in emergencies, with longer stopping distances and a greater risk of brake failure under duress. Safety technology in 1968 was still primitive by modern standards. The Bonneville featured minimal crash protection, no airbags, no reinforced side impact structures, and often, seatbelts were optional or improperly used. Combine this with the car's massive momentum and the tendency for dramatic body roll, and the Bonneville could become downright dangerous if driven aggressively or without caution. Its sheer size and weight could save occupants in a collision with smaller cars, but those safety benefits did not extend to handling crashes on curving roads or in loss-of-control scenarios. Inside, the Bonneville's cabin was a plush sanctuary, well-appointed with thick, comfortable seats, wood-grain trim, chrome details, and a wealth of luxury features. It was designed for serene highway cruising, making long drives relaxing despite the car's intimidating bulk. But behind the wheel, the experience was a study in contrast. The exhilaration of the 428 it chose power was tempered by the need for measured, deliberate inputs and respect for the car's limitations. It was a vehicle that rewarded patience, not aggression. To push the '68 Pontiac Bonneville 428 HO hard was to flirt with danger. Sudden acceleration could surprise even seasoned drivers with the engine's raw torque, but any attempt to whip the car through tight corners could result in unsettling body roll, understeer, or even loss of control. A single misjudged corner, a poorly timed swerve, or an unexpected slippery patch on the road could send the Bonneville into a precarious slide, with the driver struggling to regain control of the floating giant. Without modern electronic aids like traction control or stability control, every ounce of driver skill was tested. The 1966 Chevrolet Biscayne 427 L72 Sleeper stands as one of the most brutal and unforgiving muscle cars ever produced. A raw, stripped-down weapon disguised as an everyday full-size sedan. Unlike the flashy and aggressively styled muscle cars of its time, the Biscayne was a budget fleet car, sold primarily to taxi services, police departments, and buyers who wanted a no-nonsense vehicle. Yet under the hood, Chevrolet packed a monstrous L72 427 cubic-inch big-block V8 engine, officially rated at 450 horsepower. This was a time when that amount of power was astronomical, especially in a car with no weight-saving gimmicks beyond the basic necessities. The true irony and terror of the Biscayne 427 was its complete lack of exterior cues that would warn other drivers or even the driver themselves of what lurked beneath the hood. Without bold stripes, badging, or scoops, it blended into traffic like any other sedan from the era, earning its nickname as a sleeper. But anyone who took the time to punch the gas pedal learned quickly that this car was no ordinary sedan. It was a brutal street racer masquerading as a family car. Every aspect of the Biscayne's design was purposed for maximum performance with minimum comfort or convenience. Manual steering meant the driver had to wrestle with a heavy, direct steering wheel, especially at low speeds or when parking. Unlike many muscle cars that offered power steering to ease maneuverability, the Biscayne's wheel was stiff and unforgiving, demanding physical strength and precision from the driver. The manual drum brakes, standard issue, were woefully inadequate for the kind of speed the L72 engine could reach. Their fade resistance was minimal, and heavy foot pressure was required to stop the car, especially after a long run down the quarter mile. The interior was Spartan to the extreme. No frills, no insulation, no sound-deadening materials, and often vinyl bench seats that added to the car's utilitarian feel. Every mechanical clank, growl, and vibration from the massive engine was audible, making the driving experience intense and unrefined. The car lacked any of the comfort or luxury touches found in other models, reinforcing its sole purpose as a street-ready race car that could be driven every day if you dared. Performance-wise, the L72 427 was a beast. With a massive displacement and large valves, it produced a ferocious torque curve that could overwhelm traction instantly. Launching this big Chevy demanded skill. Too much throttle too quickly could cause wheel spin or even a dangerous loss of control, especially given the era's primitive tire technology and lack of electronic aids. The car's sheer power was both intoxicating and terrifying, rewarding only the most confident and experienced drivers with exhilarating acceleration and thrilling straight-line speed. Handling the Biscayne was another matter entirely. Being a full-size sedan, it was heavy, over 3,800 pounds in many cases, which, combined with the 427's weight up front, made for a nose-heavy chassis prone to understeer. Suspension components were basic and tuned more for durability and load carrying than sporty dynamics. Cornering was slow and imprecise, and the car felt like a boat on rails rather than a nimble sports car. The lack of radial tires and the presence of bias-ply tires meant grip was limited, adding to the challenge of driving fast on twisty roads. The car rewarded straight-line bravery but punished attempts at corner carving with harsh feedback and unpredictable behavior. Safety was minimal by modern standards. No seatbelts were standard in all models, and structural rigidity was compromised by the large body and basic frame construction. The steel wheels and drum brakes offered limited control during emergency maneuvers, and the long stopping distances could turn a simple hard stop into a perilous situation. At high speeds, the car could feel unstable and nerve-wracking, requiring constant driver attention and respect. Despite these shortcomings, or maybe because of them, the 1966 Biscayne 427 L72 gained a notorious reputation as a no-nonsense muscle car for purists who valued raw power above comfort or style. It wasn't for the casual enthusiast or the faint-hearted. The car was built for those who wanted Chevrolet's biggest and baddest engine in the simplest package possible, ready to thrash drag strips or highways with brutal efficiency. Few cars could match its combination of stealthy looks and shocking speed. Today, surviving examples of the Biscayne 427 are prized collectibles precisely because of their rarity and unique position in muscle car history. They represent a time when horsepower was king and muscle cars were at their rawest and most uncompromising. The sleeper Biscayne is a testament to Chevrolet's engineering prowess and willingness to offer a no-excuses weapon for drivers who wanted to dominate the streets without the need for flashy styling or gimmicks.